The city of Rome in Italy was a large power that controlled a giant empire. It was initially called a republic, that is, it was ruled by a mix of elected officials and a popular assembly, which took part in elections and voted on some laws. Later, several wars broke out, and Rome was finally conquered and made into an empire by Augustus in 27 BC. This event started the Pax Romana, a peaceful, prosperous period in Roman history, which stretched until 180 CE. Chaos in the 3rd century brought the Pax Romana to a close. In the late 2nd century, an outbreak of plague killed about a tenth of the population. Fewer people meant fewer taxes, which led to a weaker government. The military also stopped conquering on frontiers. This would have been a consistent source of slaves, land, and by extension money to the government. As the government grew weaker, Germanic tribesmen who had been living on the outskirts of Rome noticed and started to invade more insistently and cost the empire more money. Finally, the army had dangerous power over the emperor. Since the Germanic tribesmen were invading, the army needed to be large. In fact, it became so large that it could overthrow the empire if the soldiers got mad. Therefore, the soldiers could demand a ton of money, and the emperor had to pay up, or else the soldiers would depose him. Giving the soldiers more pay became hard for emperors to do. As money for the whole empire ran low, emperors started to raise taxes and debase coinage, or make it out of less valuable alloys. Debasing money caused hyperinflation, meaning that coins were worth less than they were before. Higher taxes were also implemented, meaning people didn't get as much money. Together, these factors made everyone, including soldiers, poor. So the soldiers would continue to demand more money. You can see where this is going. Some emperors did too. To stop the vicious cycle, they tried a different tactic, refusing to pay soldiers more. So soldiers got mad, and they went into Rome and put their generals on the throne. However, in doing this, soldiers deserted the frontiers they had been guarding, and leaving them open to invasion. Germanic tribesmen then invaded and wreaked havoc on Rome, causing the government to spend more money on defense and wrecking the economy. When Diocletian became Rome's emperor in 284, he saw a struggling nation with decimated agriculture and trade systems, unprotected frontiers, and an uncontrolled military. Therefore, he decided to pass a series of reforms to ease the problems that Rome faced. Diocletian made a few major changes to various aspects of Rome. One of Diocletian's reforms dealt with the army. At this point, the empire faced a serious administrative problem. The paradox with the army was a tough one. If the army was too weak, the empire wouldn't be protected. But if the army was strong, it could pose a threat to the empire, and possibly depose the emperor. Instead of giving the army as much money as it wanted, Diocletian controlled it. He made the army bigger, but split it up by making legions smaller. This measure ensured that individual generals had less power. After the Pax Romana, where the army could afford to be small, nobody was used to being in the military. Since men were reluctant to join, Diocletian recruited from Germanic tribes. Diocletian, power of governors was split in half as well. Instead of one person controlling both the taxes and army of a province, one person controlled each of these. One of Diocletian's most influential reforms addressed the territorial aspect of Roman life. It split the Roman Empire into two parts, the West and the East. Each part had its own administration and its own emperor and assistant emperor. He made this reform so that one emperor would not have to take on the impossible task of ruling over both halves. This reform also made the attacks from Germanic tribesmen easier to deal with. Though Diocletian's reforms brought Rome out of the tumultuous 3rd century crisis, they caused long-enduring problems for the Roman Empire as well. The reform with the most obvious negative effects for Rome was the east-west split. Though the two halves were supposed to belong to the same empire, they often acted like two different and sometimes warring ones. The halves didn't help each other out, leading to the eventual downfall of the west half of the Roman Empire by the forces of constant attacks, plague, geography, reforms, and economic crisis.
Another reason why Rome fell was Rome's geography. The East had a better geographical location than the West. The West didn't have mountains, ranges that could slow down the movement of their enemies. That made it harder for them to cover the Rhine and the Danube rivers for 1,000 miles. At the same time, the Huns, another barbaric tribe, were pushing the Germanic tribe out of their territory, which forced the Germanic tribe to move down to Rome. As a result, the West had more barbarians and invader attacks than the East did. Their resources had to go to covering those frontiers. On the other half of Rome, there was not much to cover. The East only had to cover half of what the West covered. They were not exposed to the large population of barbarians as the West did, but they still had barbarians attacks and even attacks from Persia. At one point, Persia, Arabs, and Slavs were too powerful for the Romans to handle, but they held their grounds and survived. As we know, the West started out having less resources than the East. They lacked material resources and people, which led to having internal and military problems. There were so many things they had to cover, but there were little resources. Rebellions were constantly rising, and the government had to spend much of their resources to put them down. Emperors were changing very often, and civil wars were very common. People were unhappy with the corruption of the government and thrown up for grabs. Without the resources needed to put down these rebellions were for good, they just kept rising every now and then. The East had a different story. They had an abundant supply of resources, which allowed them to develop and fix anything they needed. There was not many rebellions, and they had healthy emperors that they could lead and rule. The military was also a problem in the West. The army was missing manpower. Part of the Roman army had to go into putting down rebellions and part into protecting the West from the barbarians. They never had enough for either because they didn't have a source of new recruits. As a result, they had to hire Germanic barbarians and had help from neighboring countries to help. This put a restraint on the West because they can't freely command the army to settle their affairs. The Germanic tribe later on wreaked havoc in the West and caused chaos. While on the East, manpower wasn't a problem. They could get new recruits from Thrace and Anatolia, which the East was controlling. This means that they didn't have to hire the Germanic tribes. With what the West were given, it was especially hard for them to overcome these challenges, while everything needed for running an empire was abundant to the East.
The economy of the Western Empire was particularly fragile and declining due to the previously mentioned military reforms and geography, but mostly it was because of the constant raising of taxes and the inflation and debasement of currency. The army would demand the government for more and more money. This was to combat the threat of Germanic tribesmen that were very persistent. The emperors had to create more coins to pay. However, by paying more coins, the value of them would decrease. This was inflation. Although the value of coins declined, the wages of the people stayed the same, meaning that they were actually worth less. The debasement of coins fed into hyperinflation and was shown by the precious metal of coins. At the time, coins were the main currency and they had a certain amount of gold, silver, or bronze. Every time the emperor changed the value of coins, he also changed the amount of precious metals. Lowering the amount of precious metals in a coin is called debasement. The debasement of coins caused there to be more coins, but with less value. Therefore, the prices of commodities had to be raised in order for sellers to make a profit. The problem was that peasants and workers didn't have their wages. The amount they got paid was the same even though the economy of the Western Empire was particularly fragile and declining due to the previously mentioned military reforms and geography, but mostly it was because of the constant raising of taxes and inflation and debasement of currency. The army would demand the government for more and more money. This was to combat the threat of Germanic tribesmen that was very persistent. The emperors had to create more coins to pay. However, by making more coins, the value of them would decrease. This was hyperinflation. Although the value of coins declined, the wages of the people stayed the same, meaning that they were actually worth less. The debasement of coins fed into hyperinflation and was shown by the precious metal of coins. At the time, coins were the main currency. They had a certain amount of gold, silver, or bronze. Every time the emperor changed the value of coins, he also changed the amount of these metals. Lowering the amount of precious metals in a coin is called debasement. The debasement of coins caused there to be more coins but with less value. Therefore, the prices of commodities had to be raised in order for settlers to make a profit. The problem was that peasants and workers didn't have their wages. The amount they got paid was the same even though the value of their wages was not. This was inflation was particularly bad on those living in the city. Emperors would raise taxes to constantly pay the army. Small farmers and peasants weren't too influenced by the inflation mentioned before, but the taxes would cause them to go bankrupt. They could not afford to pay such high taxes and would have to sell themselves or their children into slavery. They would also flee to larger landowners who could afford to pay high taxes. Small farmers and peasants would work parcels of land. They would have to put a portion of their harvest to the landowners, but they didn't have to pay detrimental taxes. However, after time, they became legally tied to their plots of land. Their loyalty shifted from the empire to their respective bosses. The rapid inflation, the changing value of money, and different objects made it hard to have enough money for tax collectors. Before, people would hoard money, trying to save up by keeping coins. However, coins would rapidly change and the value of the hoards would drastically decrease. Slavery was declining at the time, so tenant farming, where people work small plots of land for larger landowners, was more financially able. It helped the declining empire, but was also part of the decline. Large landowners got support of their tenants could challenge the government. Most emperors did little to regulate the power of these large, powerful landowners. Eventually, they started to strip away the power of the government, leaving the empire weakened. The government also tried to raise money by taxing trade. However, this hurt the government even more. All trade had to go through specific posts, and certain items were not allowed into the empire. These restrictions killed any of the trade that was trying to be developed. This led to an economy where peasants, lower class, and small farmers were broke and could not support the government. Large landowners had more power, being able to stand up to the government. The government was becoming poorer and poorer, and all their efforts to raise money were all failures. In the end, reforms by Diocletian caused the empire to split into two halves. The Western Empire was already at a disadvantage due to its natural geography, which made it easier for invaders to come through. The military's power led the army to constantly demand money and the emperor to be deposed by generals. As more money was printed to deal with the demands of the army, hyperinflation kicked in and money became less valuable. The inflation of currency led to economic problems. People couldn't afford commodities. They also couldn't afford to pay the higher taxes in place. Soon they started supporting larger landowners who could protect them. All of these various causes led to a crumbling empire. By the time the large Germanic invasions and civil wars occurred, the government had already weakened. This made it easier for the collapse of the Western Roman Empire.